I stood in the freezing rain on the lawn of $1 million lake house, looking through the custom floor-to-ceiling windows I had personally drafted. Inside the warmth of the living room, my mother was pouring vintage champagne into crystal flutes for 30 guests. She raised her glass and announced to the room that my older sister Chloe had just purchased this magnificent estate. Everyone cheered. Meanwhile, I was locked outside in the dark, forced to stand on the wet grass like a hired landscaper who had overstayed her welcome. What my mother and my sister did not know as they toasted to their fake success was that my name was the only name on the legal deed. And the man standing quietly next to me in the dark was the county sheriff. They thought they stole my house. Instead, they walked straight into a trap I spent 14 months building. My name is Clara. I am a 32-year-old architect. Before I show you exactly how I dismantled their delusion tonight, please drop your age in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If you have ever had a toxic family member try to steal your hard work, hit that like and subscribe button for Sweet Karma Life. You are going to love the way this ends. Now let me take you back to how this extortion began. It started 14 months earlier at a crowded Italian restaurant in downtown Seattle. My mother Beatrice orchestrated the dinner. She never invited me to a meal unless she needed something funded. My sister Chloe sat across from me twirling her pasta. Chloe was 35 and the undeniable golden child of our family. She had bankrupted 3 separate boutique businesses using our parents' retirement savings, but in my mother's eyes, Chloe was merely waiting for her big break. I, on the other hand, ran a highly profitable architectural firm. I was not the favorite child. I was the bank. Halfway through the main course, my mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She looked at me with watered-down eyes and sighed heavily. She said, "Your father's heart condition is getting worse, Clara. The doctor says he needs peace and quiet away from the city smog. We found a beautiful empty lot up by Lake Sammamish. We want to build a small retirement home, but the bank will not give us a construction loan because of our age." Then she tightened her grip on my hand. She told me I was the only one with the resources and the architectural license to make it happen. She said it was my duty as a daughter to give my father a peaceful place to live out his final years. I looked at my father, David. He stared down at his plate and pushed a meatball around with his fork. He never defended me. He never told my mother to stop. He just let the guilt trip wash over me until I broke. I knew exactly what this was. This was a financial shakedown wrapped in a medical emergency. If I said no, I would be the villain who denied her sick father a safe home. So I looked at my mother and nodded. I told her I would buy the land. I told her I would draft the blueprints and cover the construction costs. Her eyes lit up with a greedy hunger. She immediately turned to Chloe and started talking about marble countertops and imported hardwood floors. They did not even say thank you. They just started spending my money in their heads. But I was no longer a naive 20-year-old eager for my mother's approval. The next morning, I drove to my lawyer's office. I did not wire money to my parents' account. I did not co-sign a loan with them. Instead, I formed an independent limited liability company. I registered myself as the sole owner and managing member. I purchased the lakefront lot under the LLC. Every single building permit, every contractor agreement, and the master deed itself was legally bound to my corporate entity. My parents' name appeared on zero paperwork. I let my mother believe she had successfully manipulated me into funding her dream house. I nodded politely during our phone calls when she bragged to her friends about her generous daughter. I kept my mouth shut and my legal documents locked in a fireproof safe. The foundation was poured and my mother was eager to take control. But I had no idea just how brazenly she would hand the keys over to my sister behind my back. The construction of the lake house took 14 months. It was a grueling timeline filled with concrete dust, endless supply chain delays, and the sharp smell of fresh cedar. But the real challenge was not the architecture. It was watching my family slowly infect the project with their entitlement. For 14 months, I played the role of the obedient daughter while secretly building an ironclad legal fortress around my asset. The first warning sign arrived during week 6. The foundation had just been poured, and the wooden framing was going up against the backdrop of the water. I was standing in the dirt, wearing steel-toed boots and reviewing electrical layouts with my foreman. The crunch of gravel interrupted us. A white Lexus SUV pulled into the muddy driveway. My mother stepped out wearing crisp white trousers and designer sunglasses, followed closely by Chloe. They were dressed for a country club brunch, not an active construction zone. Chloe bypassed me entirely and walked straight into the skeletal frame of the house. She ran her hands over the wooden studs as if she were greeting an old friend. My mother linked her arm through mine and smiled warmly. She said she brought Chloe along to help me with the creative decisions so I would not feel overwhelmed. I did not need help. I ran a firm with 12 employees. But I nodded and followed them inside. Chloe stood in the center of what would become the master bathroom. She pointed a manicured finger at the floor. She announced that the walk-in shower needed to be scrapped. She wanted a freestanding copper soaking tub positioned right by the window. She then demanded that the sliding glass doors in the bedroom be replaced with imported French doors. She spoke with the authority of a woman writing the checks. She did not ask for my professional opinion. She simply dictated her desires to the air, expecting me to execute them. I pulled a pen from my pocket and wrote her request down on my clipboard. I did not argue. I did not remind her that she was currently unemployed and living in a rental apartment paid for by our parents. I let her play the visionary. Growing up, Chloe always took credit for the finish line. When I was 10, I spent 3 weeks building a motorized bridge for a science fair. Chloe took it to school, claimed she helped build it, and accepted the blue ribbon on stage. My parents praised her public speaking skills. They told me I should be proud to support my sister. Now, 22 years later, she was trying to claim a $1 million piece of real estate. By month 4, the framing was complete and the delusion had migrated online. I was sitting in my office when a colleague forwarded me a screenshot from Instagram. It was a photo from Chloe's public account. The image showed a set of my proprietary architectural blueprints spread across a rustic coffee table. Her caption read, "Designing my dream oasis from the ground up. Hard work pays off." The comments section was flooded with praise from her friends congratulating her on her massive success. Then I saw the comment from Brandon. Brandon was Chloe's fiancé. He was 36 years old, wore expensive finance vests, and frequently talked about cryptocurrency startups, but had not held a steady paycheck since 2021. His comment read, "I cannot wait to fire up the grill on our new deck, babe." I did not leave a comment correcting them. I did not call my mother to complain. Instead, I clicked print. I took the warm sheet of paper from the printer and looked down at my own hands. They were not shaking. My pulse was incredibly slow and steady. I walked over to a locked filing cabinet and smoothly slid the screenshot into a thick leather binder labeled Lake House Legal. That binder was my quiet insurance policy. Inside it was a copy of the deed, the LLC formation papers, my bank statements showing every dollar transferred to the contractors, and now a growing collection of my sister's public false claims. The boundaries pushed further in month 8. The drywall was up and the interior finishes were beginning. My phone rang on a Tuesday morning. It was Dave, my lead contractor. He sounded hesitant. He said a woman named Chloe just called the stone supplier. She canceled my order for quartz kitchen countertops and upgraded the entire kitchen to imported Italian marble. It was a $20,000 upcharge. She instructed the supplier to build a master account on file. My account. I thanked Dave for the heads up. I drove straight to the site. I did not yell or cause a scene. I walked into the dusty kitchen space, handed Dave a typed laminated sheet of paper, and looked him dead in the eye. I told him I was the sole legal owner of this project. I told him that if anyone other than me attempted to authorize a material change or access the financial ledger, he was to ignore them and call me immediately. I made it clear that my family members were guests without authority. Dave nodded. He had been in the business long enough to recognize a toxic family dynamic when he saw one. I intercepted the marble order and quietly reinstated the quartz. Chloe never noticed the difference. But the ultimate violation happened in month 11. The house was finally enclosed, the windows were sealed, and I had just installed the high-end smart locks on the exterior doors. I drove up to the property late one evening to inspect the paint swatches under the artificial lighting. As I pulled my truck onto the street, I immediately turned off my headlights. Brandon's leased gray Audi was parked in the driveway. I stepped out of my truck and walked silently across the wet grass. The front door was slightly ajar. I slipped into the mudroom and stood in the shadows. I could hear voices echoing in the vaulted living room. I leaned forward and looked around the corner. Chloe and Brandon were standing in the center of the room holding a tape measure. They were actively planning where to place their sectional sofa and their flat-screen television. Brandon was drinking a beer, holding the cold glass directly over my newly finished hardwood floors. I looked down at the smart lock on the front door. The physical override cylinder, the backup keyhole, had fresh metallic scratch marks around the edges. A cold realization hit me. 2 days ago, my mother had visited my downtown office under the guise of bringing me lunch. She had been left alone in my office for exactly 5 minutes while I took a phone call in the hallway. She had dug through my desk, found the physical spare key to the construction site, and taken it to a hardware store to make copies for her golden child. I stood in the dark hallway, listening to Brandon talk about mounting a television into my custom stone fireplace. A younger version of me would have walked into that room crying, demanding to know why my own mother would betray me like this. But the woman standing in the shadows did not shed a tear. I noticed my breathing was deep and measured. My muscles were completely relaxed. Instead of grief, I just felt the cold, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I watched them measure a room they would never legally occupy. I slowly backed out of the mudroom, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. I walked back to my truck and drove away, leaving them to play house in a cage I owned. 3 months later, the project was finished. The final inspection was passed, and the city issued the certificate of occupancy. The trap was fully constructed. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final punch list when my phone screen illuminated. It was a text message from my mother. I opened it, expecting another demand for a minor aesthetic tweak. Instead, the words on the screen detailed a theft so brazen it signaled the absolute end of our family tree. The text message from my mother arrived at exactly 2 p.m. on a Thursday. I was sitting at my drafting table, reviewing the final lighting schematics for a commercial client. I picked up my phone and read the words glowing on the screen. The message did not start with a greeting. It read, "Chloe and Brandon lost their apartment lease today. They are facing severe financial hardship and have nowhere to go. Your father and I decided it is best if they move into the lake property permanently. You have a beautiful penthouse downtown and a thriving career. You do not need this massive space right now. Your sister needs stability so she can finally start a family. Be the bigger person, Clara. Family helps family. Do not make a fuss about this." I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. There was no question mark in her message. There was no asking for permission or proposing a rental agreement. It was a unilateral directive issued by a woman who did not own a single grain of dirt on that property. She had simply decreed that the fruits of my labor now belonged to her golden child. I did not reply. I did not call her to argue. I quietly locked my office door, took the elevator down to the parking garage, and got into my truck. I needed to see the reality of the situation with my own eyes. The drive to Lake Sammamish took 45 minutes. The sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light over the water. As I turned onto the private gravel road leading to the estate, my stomach tightened. Parked directly in front of the house, blocking the custom paver driveway I had spent 3 weeks designing, was a massive yellow moving van. 2 men in dirty uniform shirts were carrying a stained sectional sofa up the front steps. I pulled my truck off the road, hiding it behind a cluster of tall evergreen trees. I turned off the engine and rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in, carrying the sounds of heavy boots scraping against my brand new hand-scraped oak floors. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked silently through the trees, keeping my distance from the driveway. I needed to inspect the perimeter. I approached the front entryway from an angle where the movers could not see me. The custom solid mahogany door was propped wide open. I looked closely at the handle. The high-tech biometric smart lock I had installed just days prior was gone. In its place was a cheap, shiny brass deadbolt. The wood around the new lock was splintered and scratched, indicating someone had clumsily forced the new hardware into the doorframe. They had not just moved in. They had actively altered the security of the building. They had locked the legal owner out. Watching those movers haul cheap particle board dressers into a multi-million-dollar home triggered a very specific memory. When I was 20 years old, I worked double shifts at a diner to pay for my architectural tuition. That same year, Chloe, who was 23, crashed a leased vehicle into a retaining wall because she was texting while driving. The dealership demanded $8,000 in damages. My parents drained their emergency savings to pay the debt so Chloe would not ruin her credit score. A month later, I asked my father for a small $300 loan to buy required drafting software for my final exams. He looked at me over his newspaper and said, I needed to learn the value of hard work. He told me the bank of mom and dad was closed. The dynamic was established decades ago. I was the workhorse expected to quietly endure, while Chloe was the fragile bird who required a soft place to land regardless of the cost. They viewed my success not as an achievement to be proud of, but as a communal resource they were entitled to harvest. I stepped back into the tree line as Brandon walked out onto the front porch. He was wearing sweatpants and a backwards baseball cap. He leaned against the cedar railing, drinking from a plastic water bottle, pointing at the lawn and shouting instructions to the movers about where to place his oversized barbecue grill. He was playing the role of the proud homeowner. A younger version of myself would have marched up those steps. I would have screamed until my throat was raw. I would have demanded respect and begged them to acknowledge my pain. But standing in the damp forest, I realized my hands were resting loosely at my sides, not balled into angry fists. My chest was not tight. Emotional reactions are currency for manipulators. If I yelled, they would call me hysterical. If I cried, they would call me selfish. I retreated to my truck and climbed inside. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the thick leather binder I carried everywhere. I opened it and let my fingers trace the heavy stock paper of the warranty deed. The document was stamped by the county clerk. The ink was permanent. The raised state seal proved its authenticity. The property was registered exclusively to Clara Design Group, LLC. My name was the only authorized signature on the corporate operating agreement. In the eyes of the law, family dynamics are irrelevant. Guilt trips do not hold up in court. Only contracts matter. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for Sarah, my real estate attorney. She answered on the second ring. I kept my voice flat and even. I told her unauthorized individuals were currently moving furniture into my vacant property. I explained they had removed the smart locks and installed their own hardware without my consent or lease agreement. Sarah asked a single question. She asked if I wanted her to draft an immediate eviction notice or dispatch the local authorities right now. I looked through the windshield. I watched Chloe step out of the moving van carrying a box of wine glasses. She looked up at the house with a smug, satisfied smile. She thought she had won. She thought the game was over because I had not responded to the text message. I told Sarah to hold off on the police. I explained that if we kicked them out today, they would spin a narrative of victimhood. They would tell the entire extended family that I overreacted to a temporary misunderstanding. I needed the theft to be public. I needed them to claim ownership in front of an audience so they could never deny their intentions. I told Sarah I was going to let them unpack every single box. I was going to let them get very comfortable. Sarah chuckled softly on the other end of the line. She told me to document everything and call her the moment I was ready to drop the hammer. I hung up the phone and started the engine. I threw the truck into reverse and backed out of the dirt road, leaving my family to play house in a cage I legally owned. As I merged onto the highway, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. A new email notification popped up on the screen. It was a digital invitation forwarded by my mother. I tapped the screen at the red light. The header featured a picture of my lake house. The text read, "You are invited to Chloe and Brandon's Dream Oasis housewarming gala. Black tie optional." Below the RSVP button was a small, customized note from my mother, typed specifically for me. The note read, "Clara, since you know the layout so well, we expect you to arrive early. Please use the side catering door near the kitchen and help the waitstaff set up the champagne tower. Do not wear your work boots." They thought they stole a house. Actually, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their reputation forever. I stared at the digital invitation glowing on my phone screen while the traffic light above my truck turned green. I did not drive. I pulled over to the shoulder of the road and read the customized note from my mother a second time. She explicitly told me to use the side catering door. She instructed me to help the waitstaff set up the champagne tower. She reminded me to leave my work boots at home. This was never just about acquiring free real estate. If my family only wanted the monetary value of the property, they would have asked me to sell it and give them the cash. But my mother craved something much more sinister. She wanted to establish a permanent hierarchy. She needed to break my independence and force me into a subordinate role. By ordering the actual owner and architect of the estate to act as the hired help, she was making a massive psychological gamble. My mother knew perfectly well she had zero legal rights to the property, but she was betting everything on my lifelong habit of submissiveness. She truly believed I was still the fragile daughter who would rather surrender $1 million asset than cause a public scene in front of her country club friends. She weaponized social pressure because she knew she could never weaponize the law. Later that evening, the charade expanded into the digital world. I was sitting at my kitchen island, drinking black coffee, when my phone buzzed with a rapid series of notifications. My mother had created a new group chat titled Chloe's Dream Home. She added my father, my sister, Brandon, and several extended relatives. I watched the messages roll in. Chloe sent a video tour of the main living area. She walked barefoot across the hand-scraped oak floors, holding a glass of wine. She pointed the camera at the vaulted ceilings. She told the group chat she spent months fighting with the contractors to get the angles just right to maximize the natural light. It was a fascinating fabrication. Chloe did not even know the difference between a load-bearing wall and drywall, yet she spoke with the tired pride of a seasoned developer. Then she walked into the master bathroom and filmed the custom stone vanity. She said she chose the dark slate to contrast with the morning sun. I drafted that exact slate vanity on a Tuesday night at 3 a.m. while eating cold takeout. I sourced the stone from a specific quarry in Oregon. I negotiated the freight shipping. Now my sister was claiming my sleepless nights as her own creative genius. I scrolled past the videos and looked at the read receipts at the bottom of the screen. My father, David, had viewed every single message. For a brief, agonizing moment, the 3 gray dots of a typing indicator appeared next to his name. He was drafting a response. He was finally going to stop the madness. Then the dots vanished. He had deleted his words and locked his screen. He watched his eldest daughter publicly claim ownership of a property he knew I funded, designed, and built, and he consciously chose to let it happen. He made no phone calls to correct the narrative. His silence was the deepest cut. Growing up, my father positioned himself as the neutral peacekeeper. He always retreated to his study or hid behind a newspaper when my mother went on a rampage. He convinced himself that staying out of the crossfire made him innocent. But as I watched him read those group chat messages, I realized the ugly truth. His silence was not neutral. His silence was a co-signature on the theft. He was willing to let his youngest daughter be robbed and humiliated as long as it kept the peace in his living room. A father who watches a robbery and refuses to speak is just the getaway driver. By the 3rd day, the delusions of grandeur reached the public sphere. Chloe made her Instagram profile public and began tagging local Seattle lifestyle magazines. She posted a photo of the custom fireplace mantle I had carved from reclaimed barnwood. Her caption detailed an elaborate fake story about how she and Brandon spent their weekend scouring rural antique markets to find a perfect piece of history for their new living room. The comments from her friends poured in, asking for interior design consultations. Brandon posted a short video of himself standing on the back deck. He was smugly swirling an expensive craft beer in his glass and slowly smoothing down the lapels of a new designer vest while looking out over Lake Sammamish. His caption read, "Generational wealth starts with a vision." He was standing on a deck I paid for, drinking a beer he probably bought with my mother's credit card, talking about generational wealth. It was a masterclass in audacity. They were building a brand on my foundation. They believed my lack of a screaming reaction meant I had accepted defeat. They mistook my silence for compliance. But I was not retreating. I was simply letting them stack their lies as high as possible so the fall would break every single bone in their social structure. My mother told me not to wear my work boots to the party. She wanted me to blend in with the catering staff. She wanted me invisible. But you do not dress like a waitress when you are preparing to execute a legal slaughter. The following afternoon, I cleared my schedule. I walked out of my firm and drove to a high-end boutique in the downtown commercial district. I did not look at the floral dresses or the soft pastel blouses. I walked straight to the tailored section. I purchased a sharp, structured charcoal gray designer suit. The fabric was heavy and rigid. It felt like armor. I bought a crisp white silk shirt and black leather stilettos that would click loud and clear on the hardwood floors. I spent $2,000 on an outfit designed to demand the attention of every person in a room. I carried the garment bags back to my truck and laid them flat across the back seat. I sat behind the steering wheel and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was not going to use the side door. I was not going to pour champagne. I was going to walk through the front entrance and deliver an eviction notice in front of the most important people in my mother's social circle. But a sharp suit and a legal deed were only pieces of the puzzle. A piece of paper means nothing if you do not have the force to back it up. I needed an irrefutable authority figure to shatter their fantasy. I needed someone wearing a badge who could not be manipulated by my mother's fake tears or my sister's victim routine. I reached into the center console and pulled out a business card I had acquired weeks ago during a zoning dispute. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. I asked the dispatcher to connect me to the county sheriff. I requested a formal in-person meeting regarding an ongoing criminal trespass and a massive property theft. The dispatcher asked for the address of the incident. I read out the address of the lake house. The pieces were moving into place. It was time to arrange the raid. I walked into the county sheriff precinct at 9 in the morning. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I did not sit in the waiting area. I approached the front desk and asked for Sheriff Mitchell. Mitchell was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades untangling domestic disputes and local fraud. We had met briefly a year prior when a neighboring plat owner tried to contest the property line of my lake house. He respected paper trails. I respected the law. It was a mutual understanding. He led me into his small, cramped office. He offered me a plastic chair opposite his metal desk. I unzipped my leather briefcase and began placing the documents on his desk one by one. I did not cry. I did not offer a sob story about my childhood. I spoke in dates, dollars, and legal definitions. I laid down the original warranty deed. I placed the state-stamped articles of organization for Clara Design Group, LLC, right next to it. Then I produced a neatly bound stack of 42 separate bank transfer receipts. These were the direct wire payments sent from my corporate account to the masonry crews, the electricians, the plumbers, and the roofers. I placed a copy of the final certificate of occupancy on top. Mitchell picked up the deed. He read the legal description. He looked at the LLC paperwork. He adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair. He asked me who was currently occupying the residence. I handed him the printed screenshot of my sister's digital party invitation and the text message from my mother ordering me to use the catering door. He read them in silence. He rubbed his jaw. He looked at me and asked if I had ever signed a lease agreement with these individuals. I told him no. He asked if I had ever given them a key. I explained my mother stole a backup physical key, but more importantly, they had forcibly drilled out my biometric smart locks and installed their own hardware to gain entry. Mitchell tossed the invitation onto the desk. He leaned forward and interlaced his fingers. The moment property damage and forced entry were involved, this stopped being a civil family dispute. It was a textbook case of breaking and entering and criminal trespass in the first degree. Mitchell asked what my timeline was. I told him the party was scheduled for Friday night at 7. I explained that kicking them out on a random Tuesday morning would allow my family to spin a narrative of victimhood. They would tell the entire town I was a heartless sibling who overreacted to a temporary housing arrangement. I needed the eviction to be public. I needed the confrontation to happen in front of the very people my mother was trying to impress. I needed the local country club members, the golf buddies, and the wealthy neighbors to witness the legal reality. Mitchell nodded slowly. He understood the social dynamics of the county. He told me he would have 2 patrol cars stationed at the end of the gravel road by 6:45. He would personally walk up to the front door with me. I left the precinct and drove back to my firm. I locked my office door and spent the next 3 hours neutralizing any leverage my family might try to claim. I called the local water and power authority. I verified that the utility meters were registered under my corporate tax identification number. I instructed the representative to place a strict security passcode on the account, preventing anyone else from transferring the billing into their name. I called my commercial property insurance broker. I confirmed that my policy explicitly excluded coverage for unauthorized occupants. My lawyer Sarah emailed me the final draft of the official trespassing order. It was a cold, brutal legal document detailing the immediate removal of Chloe and Brandon from the premises. I printed 3 copies. I folded them and placed them into the inside breast pocket of my suit jacket. The trap was set, legally, but I needed to monitor the physical site. When I designed the exterior lighting plan for the lake house, I integrated a high-definition security camera into the recessed ceiling of the front porch. The lens was the size of a pinhead. It was completely invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Chloe was far too busy posing for photos to notice it. I opened the security application on my computer monitor. The live feed loaded. The wide-angle lens captured the entire driveway and the front steps. For the next 2 days, I kept the camera feed running on a secondary monitor while I worked. I watched the delivery trucks arrive one after another. A local high-end florist van pulled up on Thursday afternoon. 2 workers carried massive arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported orchids into the house. My mother stood on the porch, directing them with frantic hand gestures. On Friday morning, a catering company arrived. They unloaded stainless steel warming trays, folding tables, and crates of expensive crystal glassware. I watched Brandon carry 3 heavy boxes of vintage champagne from his trunk to the front door. He was grinning, talking on his cell phone, acting like a titan of industry, preparing to host the social event of the season. They were spending thousands of dollars to celebrate a theft. They were cementing their status using my bricks. As the sun began to set on Friday evening, the screen filled with luxury vehicles. Black Mercedes sedans, sleek silver Porsches, and oversized Range Rovers began parking along the gravel shoulder of the private road. Women in silk dresses and men in tailored dinner jackets walked up the steps, laughing and carrying expensive housewarming gifts. My mother greeted them at the door. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green gown. She hugged her friends, kissing their cheeks, pointing at the vaulted ceilings and playing the role of the generous matriarch. Chloe stood right behind her, holding a glass of wine, accepting the compliments, accepting the gifts, accepting a reality that did not belong to her. I sat in the quiet dark of my office, watching the digital feed. The time was 6:30. I closed my laptop. I stood up and took the garment bag off the back of my door. I changed into the stiff charcoal gray suit. I buttoned the crisp white shirt. I slid my feet into the black stilettos. I checked the inside pocket of my jacket, feeling the folded edge of the trespassing order. I walked out of my firm, taking the elevator down to the empty parking garage. I got into my truck and drove toward the lake. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple. The rain was just starting to fall. I pulled up to the designated meeting spot a quarter-mile from the property line. The red and blue lights of Mitchell's cruiser were dark, but the heavy silhouette of his vehicle was waiting for me in the shadows. It was time to knock on my own front door. The freezing rain felt like tiny needles against my skin. I pulled my truck onto the muddy shoulder of the access road, hiding it behind a thick row of towering pine trees. A few yards ahead, the heavy, dark silhouette of a county patrol vehicle waited in the shadows. The engine was idling quietly. The red and blue roof lights were dark. I stepped out of my truck and buttoned my charcoal gray suit jacket. The damp cold immediately seeped through the structured fabric, but I did not shiver. My body was running on a steady stream of calculated adrenaline. Sheriff Mitchell stepped out of his cruiser. He wore a heavy waterproof tactical jacket with his silver badge pinned to the chest. He closed his door with a dull thud and nodded at me. We did not exchange pleasantries. The time for planning was over. We walked side by side down the slope toward the property line. The wet gravel crunched beneath his heavy boots, while my stilettos maintained a sharp, precise rhythm. We stopped at the edge of the manicured lawn, 50 yards from the front porch. From this vantage point, out in the dark, the house looked like a glowing lantern set against the black water of Lake Sammamish. It was a stunning piece of modern architecture. I had spent countless nights refining the angles of the roofline to ensure it harmonized with the surrounding forest. I designed the massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels specifically to capture the golden hour sunset over the water. Tonight, those same glass panels acted as a giant high-definition display case showcasing my family staging their elaborate lie. The interior lights cast a warm amber glow over the open-concept living space. I stood in the freezing rain and watched the party unfold through the glass. There were at least 30 guests mingling in the room. Men wore tailored dinner jackets. Women wore elegant cocktail dresses. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms wove seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres and crystal glasses filled with champagne. It was a scene ripped straight from a luxury lifestyle magazine. I tracked my mother through the crowd. Beatrice was holding court near the kitchen island. She wore a floor-length emerald green gown that shimmered under the recessed lighting I had painstakingly mapped out on paper months ago. She was gesturing expansively, pointing toward the custom quartz countertops and the imported tile backsplash. Even through the thick glass, I could read her body language. She was nodding graciously as her wealthy country club friends murmured their approval. She was playing the visionary architect, the generous benefactor, the proud matriarch who had secured a lakeside estate for her kin. My father, David, stood near the stone fireplace. He was nursing a glass of dark liquor. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He kept checking his silver wristwatch, but he made no effort to stop the masquerade. He smiled politely when guests approached him, shaking hands and accepting congratulations for a real estate acquisition he knew he never funded. He was a silent spectator, actively participating in his own moral failing. Then the crowd began to part. The jazz music playing through the built-in surround sound system suddenly faded into silence. Chloe stepped out from the hallway. She walked toward the floating spiral staircase near the center of the room. That staircase had taken me 3 agonizing weeks to engineer. I had fought with the steel fabricators to ensure the cantilevered wooden treads could support heavy weight without any visible structural brackets. It was a masterpiece of hidden strength. Now it served as my sister's personal stage. Chloe stepped onto the 3rd rung, elevating herself above the crowd. She wore a stunning white silk dress. She tapped a silver spoon against her crystal flute. The sharp ringing sound carried through the glass. Every guest in the room turned their attention toward her. She placed a hand over her chest. She smiled a practiced, humble smile. I stood in the dark and watched her perform. I recognized that exact facial expression. It was the same smile she used 7 years ago when she launched a boutique floral business using $40,000 of our parents' retirement money. She had thrown a lavish launch party, giving a tearful speech about her entrepreneurial spirit. 6 months later, she abandoned the business, leaving a pile of unpaid vendor invoices. My parents had quietly settled the debts and swept the failure under the rug to protect her reputation. Now she was doing it again. She was standing on steps I engineered inside a house I owned, drinking champagne paid for by my mother, claiming a victory she did not earn. Through the glass, I saw Chloe raise her glass high into the air. She swept her arm in a wide arc, gesturing to the vaulted timber ceilings. She was taking credit for the sleepless nights, the raw concrete, the endless negotiations with city planners, and the deep financial risk. The guests erupted into applause. My mother clapped the loudest, beaming with pride. Sheriff Mitchell shifted his weight in the wet grass beside me. He unclipped his heavy metal flashlight from his utility belt. The rain was collecting on the shoulders of my blazer and dripping down his collar. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable in the dark. He asked if I was sure I wanted to execute the warrant right now. He warned me that walking through that door with law enforcement in front of an audience of 30 influential people would detonate a social bomb my family could never recover from. He said there would be no going back after tonight. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on my sister, who was now stepping down from the staircase to accept hugs from her admirers. I felt the cold, heavy stock paper of the trespassing order resting in the inside pocket of my jacket. I thought about the text message telling me to use the catering door. I thought about my father reading the group chat and staying silent. I turned my head and looked at the sheriff. I told Mitchell they built a grand stage because they craved an audience to validate their fantasy. I said I was just here to drop the curtain. Mitchell nodded slowly. He understood. He reached up and clicked a button on his radio, notifying dispatch we were approaching the residence. I stepped off the soft, wet grass and onto the hard concrete path leading to the front of the house. My stilettos clicked a steady, undeniable rhythm against the stone. Mitchell walked right beside me, his heavy boots grounding the moment with legal authority. We bypassed the side gate. We ignored the catering entrance near the kitchen, where my mother expected me to quietly slip in and serve her guests. We walked straight up the wide, custom-built steps toward the front entrance. I stopped in front of the solid mahogany door. I raised my hand and curled my fingers into a fist, preparing to knock. I raised my right hand and curled my fingers into a tight fist. I did not search for the decorative brass doorbell. I used my bare knuckles. 3 sharp, heavy strikes against the solid mahogany door. The sound cut straight through the muffled bass of the jazz track playing inside the foyer. I stood on the porch, letting the freezing rain drip from the cedar eaves onto the shoulders of my blazer. Sheriff Mitchell stood 1 step below me. His posture was relaxed, but his right hand rested casually near his radio. We waited. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. Through the frosted side panels, I tracked the movement of a tall shadow approaching the entryway. The heavy door swung inward, pulling a gust of warm, perfumed air out into the cold night. Brandon stood in the threshold. He held a half-empty glass of dark stout in his hand. He wore a navy blue velvet dinner jacket that looked freshly tailored. A practiced, charismatic grin was plastered across his face, ready to greet another wealthy neighbor or a potential investor for his non-existent startups. That grin died the exact instant his eyes registered the silver star pinned to Mitchell's tactical jacket. His gaze darted to me, taking in the structured charcoal suit, the sharp stilettos, and the ice in my expression. He blinked. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. The illusion of his generational wealth evaporated the moment he faced actual authority. I did not wait for an invitation. I stepped past him. My leather heels crossed the threshold and struck the hand-scraped oak floor. The sound was distinct, a sharp, rhythmic, metallic click that echoed up into the vaulted timber ceiling. The ambient temperature of the house wrapped around me, carrying the scent of expensive catered salmon, roasted garlic, and spilled white wine. I walked 10 paces into the wide foyer and stopped. Mitchell followed right behind me. He let the heavy mahogany door shut on its own. The latch clicked into place, locking us inside the crime scene. The room did not go quiet all at once. The silence happened in jagged waves. A woman standing near the coat closet stopped talking mid-sentence. A caterer holding a silver tray of caviar paused in the center of the hallway. The hush rippled outward until it reached the main living area. Someone bumped into the audio receiver and the jazz music abruptly cut off. 30 faces turned toward the entryway. They expected late arrivals bearing expensive gifts. Instead, they saw a woman in a wetsuit and a uniformed officer blocking the exit. The party flatlined in a matter of seconds. From the center of the room, the crowd parted. My mother emerged. Her emerald gown swept across the floor, brushing against the baseboards I had personally sanded and painted. I watched her face undergo a rapid, terrifying transformation. For a fraction of a second, raw, naked panic flashed in her eyes. She recognized the badge. She recognized my suit. She knew the game had changed. But muscle memory is a powerful survival tool. She hastily plastered on a strained, tight-lipped smile designed for public consumption. Her neck, however, was flushed with angry red blotches. She walked toward me at a brisk, unnatural pace. When she reached me, she did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask why law enforcement was standing in her foyer. She closed the distance, grabbed my forearm, and dug her manicured nails into the heavy fabric of my sleeve. She dropped her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. She asked what the hell I thought I was doing. She demanded to know why I had brought a cop to her daughter's celebration. Then the ultimate insult slipped through her teeth. She hissed that she had explicitly told me to use the side catering entrance. She told me I was embarrassing the family in front of the country club president, who was currently standing by the fireplace. She instructed me to apologize, take the officer outside, and go around to the kitchen to help the staff slice the cake. She was still trying to direct the play, relying entirely on social extortion. She knew she had no legal authority to kick me out, but she gambled on my fear of public embarrassment. She expected the sheer weight of her high society guests to crush my willpower and force me into submission. Years ago, that painful grip on my arm and that sharp, disappointed whisper would have made me fold. I would have shrunk down, apologized to the room, and retreated to the shadows to keep the peace. Not tonight. I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. I did not pull away. I did not flinch. I just stared at her fingers with empty, clinical detachment. I waited until the silence made her uncomfortable. She slowly released her hold, unnerved by my lack of submission. At that moment, Chloe pushed her way through the remaining guests. Her white silk dress fluttered around her ankles. Her face was pale, but her chin was thrust forward in a desperate display of bravado. She stopped next to my mother. She looked at Mitchell, then glared at me. She raised her voice, ensuring the wealthy neighbors standing near the kitchen island could hear every word. She asked me, how dare I interrupt her housewarming gala? She pointed a trembling finger toward the door we had just walked through. She ordered me to leave her property immediately. She invoked the crowd, stating that she and Brandon had worked too hard to let a jealous, bitter sister ruin their milestone achievement. She expected a screaming match. She wanted me to raise my voice. She wanted me to look erratic so she could justify her victim narrative in front of her high society friends. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father, David. He took a step back, hiding behind a tall floral arrangement. He was waiting for the explosion, avoiding the shrapnel. I gave them nothing. No tears, no raised voice, no emotional defense. I stood perfectly still. I looked around the room, making brief eye contact with the caterers, the golf buddies, and the society wives. I let them see my calm. I let them measure my stillness against my sister's frantic theatrical performance. I simply took one step backward, yielding the floor to the law. Sheriff Mitchell stepped into the space I had just vacated. He hooked his thumbs into his utility belt. The recessed lighting caught the silver badge on his chest. His voice was not loud, but it carried a heavy, gravelly weight that commanded total submission from the room. He addressed Chloe and Brandon. He stated he was responding to a verified report of breaking and entering, property damage, and criminal trespass. He explicitly noted the destroyed biometric lock on the front door and the fraudulent claim of ownership being celebrated tonight. He looked directly at Chloe, his face a mask of professional indifference. He told her that to resolve this disturbance peacefully, she needed to produce a state-issued warranty deed, a signed lease agreement, or a valid title proving her legal right to occupy the premises. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, clicked his pen, and told her she had exactly 60 seconds to provide the paperwork. 60 seconds is a very long time when you are standing in a room full of people waiting for a lie to become the truth. Chloe's confident posture crumbled. She turned her head looking frantically at Brandon, but he was staring intently at his expensive leather shoes, suddenly mute. Panic setting in, Chloe pointed a shaking finger at our parents standing by the stone fireplace. She sobbed loudly, begging our father to tell the officer the truth, claiming they had paid for the house with their retirement savings. My mother frantically grabbed my father's arm, ordering him to speak up and validate the lie. But my father, looking at the silver badge and knowing a false statement could cost him his pension, simply shook his head and remained silent. I did not let the silence linger. I walked over to the custom quartz kitchen island, unzipped my leather briefcase, and pulled out the thick legal binder. I turned to face the crowd. I introduced myself as Clara, the lead architect and sole managing member of the corporate entity that legally owned this estate. I handed the original state-stamped warranty deed directly to Sheriff Mitchell, who inspected the raised county seal and nodded. I looked at the wealthy guests and explained that 3 days ago my mother stole a backup key, drilled out my smart locks, and moved my sister into my vacant property. I told them this was not a housewarming gala, but a staged celebration of grand larceny. The room turned on my family with chilling speed. A woman in a navy blue dress set her champagne flute down, walked straight to the coat closet, and exited the front door without a word to my mother. Her departure broke the dam. Mitchell raised his voice over the murmuring crowd, advising them that they were standing inside an active crime scene. Within 3 minutes, all 30 guests and the catering staff had packed up and fled, avoiding eye contact with my sobbing sister and my frozen parents. As the massive living room emptied, leaving only the cold, damp breeze blowing through the front door, Sheriff Mitchell immediately stepped forward. He did not ask for paperwork again. He looked at the 4 members of my family and stated that because they had forcibly removed the property's original security locks to gain entry without a lease, this was an active felony. He looked at his watch. He announced they had exactly 30 minutes to gather their essential personal belongings and vacate the premises, or they will be placed in handcuffs and transported to the county jail. Brandon did not look at Chloe. He did not offer a word of comfort to the woman he planned to marry. The facade of their united power couple brand dissolved under the threat of actual consequences. Brandon turned his back on her and sprinted up the spiral staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. He was rushing to the master bedroom to pack his expensive watches, his tailored suits, and his golf clubs. He prioritized his luxury accessories over his weeping fiancé. Chloe realized she was abandoned. She lifted her head and looked across the room at our father. David was still standing by the stone fireplace. Chloe stretched out a hand toward him. She asked him what she was supposed to do. She begged him to fix the situation. David looked at his golden child. He looked at the tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. For 35 years, he had fixed every mistake she ever made. He had paid her debts, covered her lies, and smoothed over her failures. But he could not write a check to buy his way out of a state-issued trespassing warrant. He looked away from her. He buttoned his jacket, kept his eyes focused on the floor, and walked silently toward the front door. He did not say goodbye. He walked out into the rain, leaving his daughter sitting alone on the stairs. this left my mother. Beatrice stood near the kitchen island, her emerald green gown looking deeply out of place in the sterile, cold environment. She had watched her wealthy friends abandon her. She had watched her husband walk out the door. She had watched her future son-in-law reveal his cowardice. Every tool of manipulation she possessed had been stripped away. She had only one card left to play: the ultimate guilt trip. She walked slowly toward me, her posture shifted. The arrogant matriarch vanished, replaced by the image of a fragile, heartbroken mother. She let her shoulders slump. She allowed a single tear to fall down her cheek. She stopped 2 feet away from me and reached out, wrapping her cold, clammy fingers around my wrists. She lowered her voice into a trembling whisper. She told me I was making a terrible mistake. She said this was not who I was. She reminded me that she carried me for 9 months and that we shared the same blood. She pointed a shaking finger at Chloe. She asked how I could throw my own flesh and blood out into the freezing rain. She said the public embarrassment was enough of a punishment and begged me to call off the sheriff so we could sit down as a family and work things out. She was waiting for my empathy to override my logic. She expected the mention of shared blood to act as a magic phrase that would erase 14 months of calculated theft. I looked down at her hands gripping my wrists. I did not pull away violently. I simply detached myself, sliding my arms backward until her fingers grasped nothing but empty air. I looked directly into her eyes. There was no anger in my chest. There was no sadness. There was only a quiet clinical void. I told her blood is a biological fact, not a free pass to exploit my labor. I explained that she did not see me as a daughter when she stole the key from my desk. I reminded her she did not care about family when she ordered me to use the catering door at my own house. I told her a boundary is not a punishment. It is the natural consequence of her own greed. I looked up at the wall clock hanging above the hallway. I looked back at her and delivered the final blow. I told her she just wasted 10 minutes trying to manipulate a woman who no longer existed. I said she now had 20 minutes left to pack. The fragile mother routine vanished. Beatrice let out a short, bitter breath. Her eyes hardened into sharp, dark stones. She finally understood that the vault was permanently closed. She turned away from me, her silk gown dragging against the floor, and marched up the stairs to help her golden child pack her stolen life into garbage bags. For the next 20 minutes, I stood by the quartz island and watched the empire dismantle itself. Sheriff Mitchell waited near the front door, a silent guardian of the timeline. The house filled with the frantic sounds of drawers slamming shut, hangers clattering onto the floor, and heavy footsteps echoing in the hallways. They came down the stairs, carrying an absurd assortment of items. Brandon carried a plastic tote bin overflowing with designer shoes and the tangled mass of electronic chargers. Chloe dragged 2 large black trash bags filled with whatever clothing she could grab in a panic. Beatrice carried a stack of expensive velvet hangers and a jewelry box. They looked nothing like the confident homeowners who had toasted with champagne just an hour prior. They looked like looters fleeing a sinking ship. They did not speak to me as they walked toward the exit. They kept their heads down, avoiding my gaze and avoiding the sheriff. They carried their trash bags out into the freezing rain. The blue and red lights from the patrol cruiser, reflecting off the wet asphalt, painted their faces in harsh, flashing colors. I watched Brandon struggle to shove the tote bin into the trunk of his car. I watched Chloe climb into the passenger seat, shivering in her white silk dress. I watched my mother walk to her own vehicle, pulling her coat tight around her shoulders. Sheriff Mitchell stepped out onto the porch. He watched the taillights of their vehicle slowly disappear down the dark gravel road. He turned around, walked back inside, and nodded at me. He said the property was clear. He handed me his business card, told me to change the locks immediately, and wished me a quiet night. He walked out and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. The brass deadbolt clicked into place. The sudden silence in the massive house was deafening. I was standing alone in the center of $1 million estate. The intruders were gone. The stage was empty. But securing the physical building was only the first phase of my survival. The true resolution required a permanent erasure. They thought the eviction was the end of the story. They had no idea what I planned to do the moment the sun came up. The morning sun rose over Lake Sammamish, casting a sharp, cold light across the water and into the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room. I stood alone in the center of the hand-scraped oak floors. The physical remnants of my family's delusion were scattered around me. Half-empty champagne flutes sat sweating on the quartz kitchen island. Crumpled linen napkins rested on the custom stone mantel. The house smelled like stale wine and expensive perfume. It was the scent of a collapsed empire. At exactly 7 in the morning, the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of a commercial locksmith. I met him on the front porch. I watched him extract the cheap brass deadbolt my mother had illegally installed. He replaced it with a biometric steel core locking mechanism that could only be opened by my fingerprint. I paid him in cash. The perimeter was legally and physically secured. I did not pick up a single discarded napkin. I did not wash a single crystal glass. I had no intention of scrubbing away the mess my sister left behind. At 9 in the morning, a specialized corporate event cleanup crew arrived. I handed the foreman a check and told him to sanitize every square inch of the property. By noon, every trace of the housewarming gala was wiped out. The house smelled of lemon and raw cedar again. It was no longer a battlefield. It was inventory. I never intended to live in that house. Moving my own furniture into those rooms would mean sleeping inside a monument to my family's betrayal. The architecture was brilliant, but the soil was poisoned. Every time I looked at the floating spiral staircase, I would see Chloe wearing a white silk dress claiming my hard work as her own. Every time I looked at the kitchen island, I would see my mother demanding I use the catering door. I refused to live inside a museum of their disrespect. On Monday morning, I drove downtown and met with the top luxury real estate broker in the Pacific Northwest. We sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. I handed him the master keys and the final property survey. We did not discuss staging the interior with rented furniture. The house was a masterpiece of modern design on its own. We listed it quietly on a private network, strictly for high-net-worth buyers. 36 hours later, a bidding war erupted between a tech executive and a cardiac surgeon relocating from California. The surgeon won. The closing documents were signed 2 weeks later. The final sale price was $2.8 million. After deducting the raw construction costs, the contractor fees, and the initial land purchase, my corporate entity netted a pure cash profit of $1.4 million. The funds were wired directly into my business trust account. My family tried to steal a physical building to elevate their social standing. Instead, their greed directly funded my early retirement portfolio. While I was signing bank transfers, the social execution my mother feared became her permanent reality. You cannot invite the most prominent figures of a wealthy suburb to a stolen property, have them threatened with state police action, and expect to maintain your social currency. Susan, the woman in the navy blue dress who walked out of the party first, was the chair of the local country club membership committee. 2 weeks after the incident, Beatrice received a polite, legally vetted letter delivered by certified mail. The letter terminated her status at the club effective immediately. She was uninvited from the annual spring charity gala. Her phone stopped ringing. The society wives who used to drink mimosas on her patio now crossed the street when they saw her walking toward them in the downtown shopping district. For a woman whose entire identity relied on perceived status and public admiration, social invisibility was a fate worse than financial bankruptcy. She became a ghost in her own town. Chloe and Brandon faced a much harsher descent. Without an apartment lease and with zero actual savings, the illusion of their generational wealth shattered into pieces. They were forced to move into the unfinished basement of my parents' suburban home. The golden child who demanded imported Italian marble countertops was now sleeping on a cheap air mattress next to a humming water heater. The damp concrete floor replaced the hand-scraped oak she tried to steal. Brandon stopped posting photos on social media about his cryptocurrency ventures and visionary investments. Reality forced him to take a job selling mid-range sedans at a roadside dealership just to pay for his car lease. My father David now spends his evenings sitting in his living room recliner, listening to his youngest daughter argue with her fiancé through the floorboards. He lives every single day with the quiet, miserable peace he tried so hard to protect. I did not stick around to watch them unravel. I did not send the gloating text message to the group chat. I did not demand an apology. I drove to my wireless provider and changed my phone number. I instructed my real estate attorney to issue a formal cease and desist order, blocking any further contact from my parents or my sister. I severed the branches of my family tree at the root. People often ask me if I feel guilty. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable contract. We are taught to forgive endless disrespect simply because the person hurting us shares our last name. We are told to be the bigger person, to keep the peace, and to let family be family. But peace that costs your dignity is not peace. It is a payment plan for someone else's comfort. I spent 32 years auditioning for a seat at a table where I was only valued for what I could provide. The moment I stopped paying the admission fee, the seats were removed. A boundary is not a tool for revenge. It is an act of survival. You do not owe your abusers a soft landing just because they are related to you. My silence in the face of their cruelty was not surrender. It was the time I used to gather the evidence, build the case, and secure my future. If you are sitting in the dark right now, looking at your own family and wondering why your hard work is never enough, hear this. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to change the locks. You are allowed to keep the keys to the life you built. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. My name is Clara. I am an architect and I designed my own way out. If this story validated a struggle you have been carrying, or if you have ever had to cut ties to save yourself, share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. Hit that like and subscribe button for Sweet Karma Life. Remember, the best response to toxic people is not an argument. It is a brilliant, undeniable success. I am sitting on the balcony of my new apartment in Florence, Italy. The air smells like roasted espresso and old stone, a sharp contrast to the damp pine and concrete dust of Lake Sammamish. The profit from the sale of the lake house sits quietly in a diversified trust. I do not check my bank app to feel validated. I check the horizon. I have not spoken to my mother, my father, or my sister in 2 years. I do not know if Brandon ever found a real job, or if my mother dared to show her face at the country club again. I do not track their ruin. My revenge was never about their destruction. It was about my liberation. Looking back at the 14 months of calculated silence, the fake smiles, and the ultimate legal eviction, I realized that surviving a toxic family requires a fundamental rewiring of how you view obligation. If you are holding the checkbook while someone else takes the credit, here are the 3 undeniable truths I learned from burning my own family tree down to the roots. First, blood is a biological fact, not a lifelong debt. You do not owe anyone your financial stability simply because you share a genetic lineage. A title like mother or sister is a description of relation, not a license for exploitation. Second, silence is a weapon. Manipulators thrive on your emotional reactions. When you stop reacting and start observing, you take away their power and buy yourself the quiet time needed to build an ironclad trap. Third, documentation beats manipulation every single time. Gaslighting shatters against state-issued warranty deeds and bank wire receipts. Do not argue with a narcissist, and do not wait for them to apologize. Just step away and let the law speak for you. I used to think my value was measured by how much I could carry for the people around me. I know better now. My value is inherent, and my peace is non-negotiable. I built a fortress. They tried to steal it, and I sold the bricks to buy my freedom. If you are sitting in the dark right now, wondering if you are crazy for wanting to walk away from the people who are supposed to love you, hear me. You are not crazy. You are waking up. I want to hear your stories. Drop your experiences in the comments below. Let this community be the validation your family refused to give you. Hit that like and subscribe button for Sweet Karma Life, because sometimes the most beautiful ending is the one where you finally choose yourself.